Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. Chapter 1. Monday, May 27th, 1776. Youth is the seed time of good habits, as well in nations as in individuals. Thomas Paine, Common Sense. The best time to talk to ghosts is just before the sun comes up. That's when they can hear us true, Mama said. That's when ghosts can answer us. The eastern sky was peach-colored, but a handful of lazy stars still blinked in the west. It was almost time. "May I run ahead, sir?" I asked. Pastor Weeks sat at the front of his squeaky wagon with old Ben next to him, the mule's reins loose in his hands. The pine coffin that held Miss Mary Finch, wearing her best dress with her hair washed clean and combed, bounced in the back when the wagon wheels hit a rut. My sister Ruth sat next to the coffin. Ruth was too big to carry, plus the pastor knew about her peculiar manner of being, so it was the wagon for her and the road for me. Old Ben looked to the east and gave me a little nod. He knew a few things about ghosts, too. Pastor Weeks turned around to talk to Mr. Robert Finch, who rode his horse a few lengths behind the wagon. "The child wants to run ahead," Pastor explained to him. "She has kin buried there. Do you give leave for a quick visit?" Mr. Robert's mouth tightened like a rope pulled taut. He had showed up a few weeks earlier to visit Miss Mary Finch, his aunt and only living relation. He looked around her tidy farm, listened to her ragged, wet cough, and moved in. Miss Mary wasn't even cold on her deathbed when he helped himself to the coins in her strong box. He hurried along her burying, too. Most improper. He didn't care that the neighbors would want to come around with cakes and platters of cold meat and drink ale to the memory of Miss Mary Finch of 2, Rhode Island. He had to get on with things, he said. I stole a look backward. Mr. Robert Finch was filled up with trouble from his dirty boots to the brim of his scraggly hat. "Please, sir," I said. "Go then," he said, "but don't tarry. I've much business today." I ran as fast as I could. I hurried past the stone fence that surrounded the white graveyard to the split-rail fence that marked our ground, and stopped outside the gate to pick a handful of chilly violets, wet with dew. The morning mist twisted and hung low over the field. No ghost yet, just ash trees and maples lined up in a mournful row. I entered. Mamma was buried in the back, her feet to the east, her head to the west. Some day I would pay the stone carver for a proper marker with her name on it. Dinah, wife of Cuff, mother of Isabel and Ruth. For now there was a wooden cross and a gray rock the size of a dinner plate lying flat on the ground in front of it. We had buried her the year before, when the first roses bloomed. "Smallpox is tricky," Miss Mary Finch said to me when Mamma died. "There's no telling who it'll take." The pox had left Ruth and me with scars like tiny stars scattered on our skin. It took Mamma home to our Maker. I looked back at the road. Old Ben had slowed the mules to give me time. I knelt down and set the violets on the grave. "It's here, Mamma," I whispered, "the day you promised. But I need your help. Can you please cross back over for just a little bit?" I stared without blinking at the mist, looking for the curve of her back or the silhouette of her head wrapped in a pretty kerchief. A small flock of robins swooped out of the maple trees. "I don't have much time," I told the grass-covered grave. "Where do you want us to go? What should we do?" The mist swirled between the tall grass and the low-hanging branches. 2 black butterflies danced through a cloud of bugs and disappeared. Chickadees and barn swallows called overhead. Whoa! Old Ben stopped the wagon next to the open hole near the iron fence, then climbed down and walked to where Nehemiah, the gravedigger, was waiting. The 2 men reached for the coffin. "Please, Mamma," I whispered urgently, "I need your help." I squinted into the ash grove where the mist was heaviest. No ghosts. Nothing. I'd been making like this for near a year. No matter what I said, or where the sun and the moon and the stars hung, Mamma never answered. Maybe she was angry because I'd buried her wrong. I'd heard stories of old country burials with singers and dancers, but I wasn't sure what to do, so we just dug a hole and said a passel of prayers. Maybe Mamma's ghost was lost and wandering because I didn't send her home the right way. The men set Miss Mary's coffin on the ground. Mr. Robert got off his horse and said something I couldn't hear. Ruth stayed in the wagon, her bare feet curled up under her skirt and her thumb in her mouth. I reached in the pocket under my apron and took out the oat cake. It was in 2 pieces, with honey smeared between them. The smell made my stomach rumble, but I didn't dare nibble. I picked up the flat rock in front of the cross and set the offering in the hollow under it. Then I put the rock back and sat still, my eyes closed tight to keep the tears inside my head where they belonged. I could smell the honey that had dripped on my hands, the damp ground under me, and the salt of the ocean. I could hear cows mooing in a far pasture and bees buzzing in a nearby clover patch. If she would just say my name, just once! "Girl!" Mr. Robert shouted. "You there, girl!" I sniffed, opened my eyes, and wiped my face on my sleeve. The sun had popped up in the east like a cork and was burning through the morning mist. The ghosts had all gone to ground. I wouldn't see her today either. He grabbed my arm and pulled me roughly to my feet. "I told you to move," Mr. Robert snarled at me. "Apologies, sir," I said, wincing with pain. He released me with a shove and pointed to the cemetery where they buried white people. "Go pray for her that owned you, girl." Chapter 4. Monday, May 27th through Wednesday, May 29th, 1776. What a fine affair it would be if we could flit across the Atlantic as they say the angels do, from planet to planet. Letter from John Adams to his wife Abigail. It took 2 nights and 2 days for the Hartshorn to sail from Newport to the city of New York. Ruth and me were housed below the packet boat's deck with 6 sheep, a pen of hogs, 3 families from Scotland, and 50 casks of dried cod. At the far end of the hold were crates of goods stamped Lockton and Foote, and casks of rum with the same marking. I spent most of the voyage bent double over a puke bucket, bringing up every scrap of food and swallow of brackish water I choked down. Ruth stood on a box looking out of a porthole, counting seagulls and waves in a whisper that could barely be heard over the creaking of the hull. The seas calmed late on the 2nd night, and I was able to walk a bit. Ruth was sound asleep in our hammock, thumb in her mouth. The hatchway to the deck was open and tempting. I climbed up the ladder slowly. The few sailors on watch saw me, but didn't say a word. The fat moon lit the water like a lantern over a looking-glass. A clean, cold breeze blew from the north, pushing the ship so fast across the sea we seemed to fly. I sat on a crate facing the back end of the ship and hugged my knees to my chest. A mist of salty spray hung in the air. The coastline of Rhode Island had long disappeared into darkness. I could not see where we came from or where we were going. Maybe the ship would spring a leak and sink. Maybe we would be blown off course and land in a country without New York or people who bought and sold children. Maybe the wind would blow us in circles until the end of our days. I wiped the mist from my face. Mama said that ghosts couldn't move over water. That's why kidnapped Africans got trapped in the Americas. When Papa was stolen from Guinea, he said the ancestors howled and raged and sent a thunderstorm to turn the ship back around, but it was too late. The ghost couldn't cross the water to help him, so he had to make his own way in a strange place, sometimes with an iron collar around his neck. All of Mama's people had been stolen too and taken to Jamaica, where she was born. Then she got sold to Rhode Island, and the ghosts of her parents couldn't follow and protect her neither. They kept moving us over the water, stealing us away from our ghosts and our ancestors who cried salty rivers into the sand. That's where Mamma was now, wailing at the water's edge while her girls were pulled out of sight under white sails that cracked in the wind. Chapter 7. Wednesday, May 29th, 1776. I hired a girl to clean the house. It had a cartload of dirt in it. One of the chambers was used to keep poultry in, and another sea-coal, and another salt. You may conceive how it looked. The house is so exceeding damp, being shut up, that the floors are mildewed, the ceiling falling down, and the paper mouldy and falling from the walls. Letter from Abigail Adams to her husband, John. It was near a mile from the tea-water pump back down the island to the Lockton house, a long journey carrying heavy buckets that stretched my arms into sore ribbons. I forgot the pain when Curzon stopped, pointed, and said, "There 'tis." The house was made of blocks of cream-colored stone and was wider from side to side than Jenny's tavern. I tilted my head up and counted. 4 floors, each with big windows facing the street. There were balcony railings on the roof. There were even windows peeking out at foot level, cellar windows, which meant 5 stories in one house. A curtain moved. "Make haste," Curzon said. "If you value your life, don't use the front door." The sun caught the ring in his ear and blazed as he tipped his hat to me. I hurried through the side gate. The mansion was twice as long as it was wide. A large plot stretched behind it with a cistern, a privy, a poor excuse for a garden, and at the far end a carriage house and small stable. "You there!" I turned around. A tiny woman wearing a green calico skirt, a nut-brown bodice, and a dingy shift stood in the open door to the kitchen. She tossed a pan of dirty water onto the flagstones and pushed a strand of graying hair out of her eyes with the back of her hand. "What's your business here?" she demanded. "I'm Isabel. I'm the Master Lockton brought us from Newport." The anger drained out of her face. "You're the new girl? Gone for the water? Lord help us, did you get lost?" I don't think so. Curzon, funny little boy, ring in his ear." She shook her head. "That's Bellingham's boy. You stay away from him. Bring in that water. We've a world of work to do." Her name was Becky Berry. "Though it'll be mud if I don't pull this house together in a flash," she said as she poured the fresh water into a pot and swung it over the kitchen fire. She barely stopped talking long enough to draw a breath. 8 months! They vanished to Boston for 8 months and then show up with no warning and wanting tea. "Tea! I could get tarred and feathered for brewing tea," she muttered. She turned around. Her face marked her as being of middle years, dotted with freckles and pox scars. Her chin was narrow and pointed like a shovel, and her smile was missing several teeth. "The rules here is simple. Do what Madam says. You know where the tea-water pump is. You'll go up there every day. You'll go with me to market when I need you to. Don't go north of Chambers Street or wandering off past Mulberry lest Madam writes you a pass. You don't want folks thinking you're trying to run. That don't work here. You been a housemaid before?" I shook my head. "We lived on a farm. Pardon me, ma'am, Miss Becky, but can you tell me where my sister is?" "Your what?" Her eyes went up. "Oh, that little girl." I nodded. "Ruth. She's slow, ain't she?" I didn't dare explain until I figured what kind of person Becky was. "She's good-natured." Becky walked into a pantry crowded with shelves of crockery. "Not going to cause me trouble?" "Never," I lied. "Where is she, please, ma'am?" Becky came out carrying a tarnished silver teapot and a stack of china cups and plates. "Madam Lockton told me to give the little one a bath and feed her." She went back to the pantry and shouted a little so I could hear her. "She's in the privy. Your sister, I mean, not the madam." I let out a long breath and stepped toward the door. Becky came back carrying a small chest. "Where do you think you're going?" "To fetch Ruth." "Oh, no, you are not," Becky said. "Madam wants her outside peeling potatoes. You're to work in here." "But—" Through the window I watched Ruth leave the privy and walk straight to a bench. She hopped up on it, pulled a potato from the sack. next to her and started peeling with a small knife, her feet kicking in the air under the bench. She looked like a little bird on a twig. I relaxed some. She was safe and happy enough. Becky brushed at the cobwebs clinging to her skirt. But nothing. If Madam sees you idling and jawing out there, there'll be the devil to pay. She paused. She can be a harsh mistress to slaves. I waited for her to say more, but she shook her head once and handed me a broom. Me, I see things different. She picked up a pile of rags and a jar. You do what you're told and we'll get along fine. Now follow me and pay attention. Becky led me down a narrow corridor to the front entry hall where a grand staircase curled upward. A tall grandfather clock sat at the foot of the stairs, pecking away at the hour as if a crow trapped inside were trying to break loose. The walnut linen chest that Madam had fussed over at the dock was set in front of the clock. Opposite the chest was the door that led to the street. Two other doors with tarnished brass pulls faced the hall. Becky pointed to the door on the right. That there's the master's library. You don't step foot in it without permission. He don't like his things touched. A library with books? And maps and papers and all in a jumble. It's a wonder he can find anything. She opened the door and on the left and entered me at her heels. This is the good parlor where I'll serve the tea. The drawing room is upstairs. We'll clean up there later. Open them windows. The room was crowded with furniture draped with cloth. The air was thick and stale. I pulled aside the heavy drapes and stretched on my toes to push up the window. The sills were dusty and the corners were spun thick with spider webs, studded with dead flies. I went to open the next window as Becky laid out a rag on each sill. Wipe down the windows and sweep the floor before you uncover the furniture, she said. The second window was stubborn. I pushed as hard as I could until it suddenly flew up and I near lost my balance. Becky grabbed me before I tumbled outside. Easy on, she said as I regained my balance. You're no good to me with a cracked head. 3 soldiers wearing homespun shirts and carrying muskets walked past the window, laughing loudly. I wish they'd all go home, Becky muttered. Soldiers is a nuisance. You don't like the rebels? I asked. Becky put a finger to her lips and pulled me away from the window. Listen to me good. Them that feeds us, she pointed upstairs, they're loyalists. Tories. That means we're Tories too, understand? Yes, ma'am, I nodded, but I hesitated, not sure if I was allowed to ask questions. Master Lockton claimed he was a patriot on the docks. Becky fought to open the final window. A cool breeze flowed through the room and stirred the dust. He was faking to protect his skin. Some folks switch back and forth. One day they're for the king, the next it's all liberty and freedom, huzzah! A tribe of Mr. Facing both ways, that's what you'll find in New York. But you know what never changes? I shook my head. No, what? Madam wants lemon cakes with her tea. She is terrible fond of cakes, is Madam. Lady Clarissa Seymour is coming to hear all the news from Boston. A lady? A royal lady? Becky laughed. Close enough. She's the master's aunt. She's rich and owns land in 3 countries. The master hopes to inherit the lot when she dies, so they treat her like the queen herself, to her face at least. The grandfather clock in the hall bonged loudly 4 times, startling us both. Wretched clock, Becky muttered. I'm off to the baker. Finish sweeping in here and dusting. After that, polish the teapot and bring in the firewood. Don't stop moving, whatever you do. Chapter 11. Friday, June 7th, 1776. There is nothing more necessary than good intelligence to frustrate a designing enemy, and nothing requires greater pains to obtain. Letter of George Washington to Robert Morris. It felt like Becky shook me awake the moment I fell asleep. Make haste, girl, she hissed. You didn't start the fire. Why are you still abed? Haste was the word of the day. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't catch up. It did not help that Madam was in a mood. Girl, she said to me as I prepared to sweep the kitchen floor, the bedding needs to be aired. Yes, ma'am. I set the broom back in its place and went upstairs, where I stripped off the bedding, carried it outside, and pegged it to the line. Just as I finished, Madam opened the back. Door. "Why are you dawdling so?" she yelled. "The floor in here is filthy, and the banister needs to be polished, and I told you to wear your shoes in my house." After I squeezed my feet into those small, dreadful shoes, it was back to the sweeping, and then the polishing of the banister with soft rags and beeswax, scented with lemon. When I made it halfway up the stairs, Madame yelled at me for airing the bed linen on a day that threatened rain. At least she did not call for Ruth's company. Becky had set my sister to scrubbing the back steps. Ruth hummed so loudly it put me in mind of a swarm of bees in clover. As I gathered in the sheets, I watched the gate, waiting for the rebels to arrive to arrest the Locktons and reward me with our liberty. We would be given proper cabins on the ship, I was sure of it. No more riding in the hold with barrels of salt cod. Ruth and me would have a cabin fit for ladies, with bunks and blankets and pillows and 3 meals every day. Yes, indeed, that was my future. "Aren't you done yet?" Becky yelled from the back door. "We have to prepare the drawing room." I shook away my daydreams. The drawing room on the second floor wasn't a room where folks sat with paints and colored chalk to draw pictures like I'd figured. It was another parlor, 3 times the size of the one downstairs. We removed the sheets covering the furniture. A dozen chairs with needlework seats were scattered around the room, organized around tables with delicate legs. A low settee stood in front of the fireplace, and a mirror framed in mahogany hung above the mantel, flanked by oil lamps fastened to the walls. "Why this room has to be prepared is beyond me," Becky muttered as we folded the sheets together. "No staff to speak of, the larder half empty, the city getting ready to explode, and she wants this turned out and polished. Of all the foolish—" A loud beating on the front door interrupted her. "Dash it all!" Becky exclaimed as she clattered down the stairs. "Keep folding," she called to me. Not for love nor money, I peered out a front window. The group of men clustered on the front steps did not look like angels, but they could have been in disguise. 4 wore the coats, breeches, powdered wigs, and hats of merchants. 1 had papers tucked under his arm. 6 soldiers stood behind them, all wearing uniforms, but carrying long metal bars instead of guns. Becky opened the door and the men filed inside. I stepped out into the hall and peered down the stairs. The man with the papers under his arm had removed his hat. It was Master Bellingham. My heart sang. A door slammed overhead as Madame flew out of her chamber. What is the meaning of this? I pressed myself against the wall so she could rush by me, then followed her down the stairs. The soldiers had split into 2 groups. Half went into the front parlor and the other half into Lockton's library. Both groups set to removing the windows, prying them out of their casings with the long bars. "What are you doing to my windows?" Madame demanded. Bellingham approached her. "No need to fret, ma'am. We are all called to make sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" Master Lockton asked as he hurried in. "This is thievery. What right have you to destroy my home?" There was a horrific crash in the parlor as the hooks that held up the heavy draperies flew off the wall and landed on the floor. Plaster dust swirled. Bellingham removed the papers under his arm. "You surprise me, Elihu," he said. "I thought a patriot such as yourself would welcome the chance to contribute to the army." Beads of sweat stood at the edge of Lockton's wig. "How does that pertain to the ripping down of my house, James?" Bellingham patted Lockton's shoulder. "We need your lead, friend, for ammunition. Good people throughout the city are donating all the lead they own. The Provincial Congress will compensate you, of course, in due time. I've invoices prepared." Madame frowned. "How is it possible to turn windows into bullets?" "The counterweights are made of lead, ma'am," Bellingham explained, "and your drapery pulls." "This is an outrage," Lockton fumed. "No, Elihu," Bellingham said, "this is war. Even our churches are making the sacrifice, delivering their bells to be recast as cannon. Surely you do not rate your home above the houses of God." The soldiers left the library, deposited the lead weights by the front door, and headed up to the second floor, knocking their shoulders against the paintings of the Lockton ancestors that lined the staircase. I wanted to shout that they should search for the money in the linen chest, Instead, I shrank against the wall to let them pass. They haven't restored the windows to the frames, protested Lockton. Where are they going? Madam asked. There are plenty of carpenters who will assist you with the windows if you don't feel up to the task yourself, Elihu, Bellingham said. Sir, shouted a soldier upstairs, we found it. Bellingham dropped his manners and bounded up the stairs 2 at a time. Madam and Lockton followed close on his heels. I trailed behind. The bedchamber was a large room made small by the 4-poster canopy bed that sat as high as a carriage, 2 massive armoires, and a half-dozen men with red faces. Madam had once again set herself on her walnut linen chest, which sat in front of the hearth. Why was it up here? Of all the insults, of all the assaults on the dignity of a woman, she said to Bellingham, this, sir, is the lowest, the most base. I shall see to it that every leader in every land knows. Madam, Bellingham said sternly, if you do not take your person from that chest, I shall order these soldiers to remove you. You would not dare, she said. Yes, he would, dear, Lockton said. Please, wife, let these men do their work with no further delay. There is nothing to worry about. He seemed to hide a message beneath those words, for Madame relaxed some and stood with grace. If you insist, husband, she said. Perhaps you would prefer to go below stairs, Lockton suggested. The girl can heat some wine to calm your nerves. Madame shook her head. No, dear, I shall remain by your side. Bellingham gave the sergeant a quick nod. The man knelt in front of the chest and opened the latch. Deliverance! They'll arrest them both and reward me mightily. We'll leave this horrid place by sunset. One corner of Lockton's mouth turned up in a sly smile as a blushing soldier removed the shifts and underskirts. My heart skipped a beat. Why were the dirty linen still in there? Becky gathered all the washing yesterday. The soldier looked up at Bellingham. That's all, sir, clear down to the bottom. I wanted to shout, the money is underneath the false bottom, but pressed my lips together. Bellingham knelt and checked for himself, knocking the wooden sides. Lockton's grin had spread to both sides of his mouth. Would you care to inspect all of our clothing, James? Perhaps you'd send a man to root through the potatoes and parsnips in the cellar. He had hidden the money elsewhere. That's why he was at ease. Bellingham rose to his feet and stood with his hands behind him. Would he turn on me, accuse me of making a false report and expose me to the Locktons? No. He searched through his papers until he pulled out one that he handed to Lockton. You are summoned to the New York Provincial Congress for suspicion of aiding the enemy, Elihu. I am placing you under arrest. These soldiers will escort you. He nodded his head. 2 soldiers grabbed Lockton by his elbows. His smile vanished. Wait, Madam said. You can't arrest him. He's done nothing. To the contrary, ma'am, Bellingham snapped. He has put the lives of thousands in jeopardy. The men filed by me without another word. Bellingham kept his face straight ahead, but as he passed by, he cut his eyes at me. They drilled a hole right into my fear of discovery. There was the clatter of boots on the stair treads, then boots on the marble steps outside, and then the crash of the front door slamming. They were gone. Madame stared blankly at the empty doorway. Ma'am? I asked quietly. Her eyes turned to me, then she blinked as if she suddenly realized who I was and where she stood. Don't just stand there, girl. These linens need to be washed. I can't think how Becky missed them. I shall speak to her about her laziness. And then she fainted.